The idea that life might exist beyond our own planet has fascinated people for generations. And once that question enters your mind, another one usually follows. If intelligent beings are out there somewhere, looking up at their own skies, do they ever wonder about us the way we wonder about them? Stories about strange lights, unidentified craft, and mysterious objects in the sky have been told for as long as people have been able to look upward and ask questions. But the modern obsession with visitors from other worlds grew dramatically after two highly publicized incidents in the United States. Those events became part history, part mystery, and part legend. Even now, they continue to shape the way people think about unidentified flying objects, secret military programs, and the possibility that something unknown may have already visited Earth. The first incident took place near a small island in the Pacific Northwest, roughly 6 miles west of Des Moines, Washington. A harbor patrolman named Warren Dale was out on the water with 2 younger crewmen, his son and his dog. What began as an ordinary patrol changed the moment Warren looked up and noticed 6 strange objects hovering high above the boat. According to Warren and the others, the objects were highly reflective and shaped almost like flat rings or flattened donuts. They estimated that each was roughly 100 feet across, with a central opening around 25 feet wide. Smaller circular features could be seen along the sides, and the crew believed those circles might have been observation windows. At first, 5 of the objects appeared to circle around the 6th. Then the lower object slowly descended toward the patrol boat. The crew panicked. From where they stood, it looked as though the object might come directly down on top of them. Nobody wanted to wait around and find out. They rushed toward shore and got out of the boat as quickly as they could. Once they reached land, Warren grabbed a pair of binoculars and a camera. If no one believed what they had seen, he wanted something that might help prove it. Through the binoculars, he watched the lower object remain almost motionless, while the other 5 circled above it. After several minutes, the lower craft suddenly dropped again, stopping only a few hundred feet above the water. One of the other objects descended toward it. The 2 remained close together. Then Warren heard what sounded like a dull thump. Another followed, then another. When he looked through the binoculars again, he saw material falling from the opening in the center of the lower object. At first, he thought the pieces looked like sheets of paper fluttering through the air. But as they came closer, the crew realized the material was something else entirely. Some pieces looked like a light white metal. Others looked like dark lava-like rocks. Warren later claimed that when some of those dark fragments struck the water, steam rose from the surface. The falling debris began landing closer to the patrol boat, forcing the crew to take cover. According to the story, one piece struck Warren's dog and killed it. Another injured his son in the arm. Warren tried to call for help, but the radio would not work. Most of the debris eventually fell into the water. Then, almost as suddenly as they had appeared, the strange objects rose into the sky and moved away together toward the west. When the crew returned to the boat, they were relieved to find that it had suffered little damage. They headed back toward the dock, and along the way, they lowered the body of Warren's dog into the water in a simple burial at sea. After they returned, Warren took his son to receive medical treatment. Then he told his supervisor, Grant Mercer, what had happened. Grant did not believe him. The photographs Warren had taken were developed, but the strange objects were not clearly visible. Marks on the film were dismissed as defects, noise, or damage rather than proof of unusual aircraft. Warren refused to let the matter go. He returned to the island area and searched for fragments of the material that had fallen from the sky. While collecting samples, he claimed that one of the same strange craft appeared above him, hovering as though it were watching. Warren gathered several unusual pieces and planned to show them to Grant. Before he could do that, however, something even stranger happened. A pale, unfamiliar man wearing a dark suit approached him and suggested they have breakfast together. Warren agreed. At the restaurant, the stranger did not ask him questions. Instead, he calmly described the previous day's encounter in remarkable detail, including information Warren believed he had not shared publicly. Then the man warned him. According to Warren, the stranger said that terrible things could happen to him and his family if he continued investigating the incident or speaking about it. The warning did not stop him. Warren showed the fragments to Grant, and Grant's attitude changed. He began to believe that something unusual really had happened. Together, they sent a package to a publisher in Chicago named Raymond Palmer, who would later become closely associated with magazines devoted to unexplained phenomena. Inside were pieces of the strange material and written statements describing what Warren and his crew claimed to have witnessed over the course of the encounter and the following investigation. The event became one of the earliest widely discussed unidentified flying object cases of the modern era. But another incident soon overshadowed it completely. That second case took place near a small desert town in New Mexico. Reports spread that a mysterious disc-shaped object had crashed in the desert near a military installation. Almost immediately, extraordinary rumors followed. Some people claimed that unusual bodies had been recovered from the wreckage. Others said the remains and debris had been taken to a secret military facility in the Nevada desert for examination. A military announcement then appeared to confirm something astonishing. The statement said that personnel had recovered what was described as a flying disc. News organizations around the country reacted instantly. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the impossible had become official. Then the story changed. Military authorities announced that there had been a mistake. The object, they now said, was not a flying saucer at all. It was a weather balloon. Many members of the public accepted the explanation, and the story faded from national attention. Years later, however, people connected to the military began speaking publicly about what they believed had really happened. One of the most important witnesses was an intelligence officer named Everett Hale. Everett had been among the military personnel sent to examine the crash area. He described finding a wide field of metallic debris scattered across the ground, suggesting that whatever had come down had struck with tremendous force. Everett insisted the material did not resemble an ordinary balloon, aircraft, or missile. He said some fragments were incredibly light and thin, almost like foil, yet unusually strong. He also described markings that looked unfamiliar, almost like strange symbols or hieroglyphic writing. According to Everett, the material was unlike anything he had encountered before. He later suggested that the military had recovered more than one piece and that some of the material was preserved at a secure installation. Everett also spoke privately with members of his family about the incident. His relatives later said he repeatedly described himself as one of the lead intelligence officers assigned to examine the mysterious debris. As public curiosity grew again, the National Security Agency released another explanation many years after the original incident. The report said that stories about alien bodies were likely connected to life-sized test dummies used in military experiments. To skeptics, that explanation made sense. To believers, it sounded like another attempt to close a story that refused to stay closed. More witnesses came forward. One photographer claimed he had been asked to document part of the crash site. He said he entered a darkened area and saw several small bodies with unusually large heads and grayish skin. He claimed he photographed what he saw and was later ordered never to discuss it. Then another former military officer, Dean Porter, made a statement late in his life that reignited the controversy. Dean had been involved with the original military announcement about the recovered object. In a sworn written statement, he claimed the weather balloon explanation had been a cover story. He also said that a craft had been recovered and that he had personally seen unusual bodies connected to the incident. That claim remains fiercely disputed. No universally accepted physical evidence has ever settled the matter. The official explanations have changed over the years. Witnesses have disagreed. Memories have become harder to verify. And many of the people who were there are now gone. That leaves the same question hanging over both of these famous cases. What actually happened? Were they misunderstandings? Secret military experiments? Exaggerated stories that grew more dramatic over time? Or were people really witnessing something that came from somewhere beyond Earth? As the years pass, the answer becomes harder to reach because witnesses disappear, documents remain disputed, and memory becomes less reliable. Until governments release evidence strong enough to settle the matter, or another undeniable event happens in full view of the world, these cases will remain exactly where they have always been, between history and mystery. And while those two stories became some of the most famous unidentified flying object cases ever discussed, they are only a tiny part of the larger phenomenon. Thousands of people around the world have reported strange lights, missing time, unusual beings, unexplained dreams, and encounters that they believe may have involved something not from this world. The stories that follow are personal accounts. Some may have ordinary explanations. Some may have been dreams, sleep disorders, memory distortions, stress, or misunderstood events. Others are harder to explain. What matters is that the people telling them remember the experiences as real. And many of them say those memories change the way they see the world forever. I never told many people what happened to me because I assumed they would think I was imagining it. I was home alone one night. I normally live there with my partner and our 2 indoor cats. But she was away on a business trip. I went to bed like normal. Then sometime during the night, I woke up because I was freezing. I usually prefer a cool room when I sleep, especially because I live in Central Texas. But this cold felt completely different. I was wrapped in blankets and still felt as though the temperature had dropped to an unnatural level. I reached for my phone to check the time. The screen was black. I pressed the power button. Nothing happened. I was still half asleep, so I didn't think too much about it. I got out of bed and walked toward the thermostat. That was when I noticed something else. The cats were gone. That might not sound important, but those 2 animals were almost always on the bed, under the bed, or somewhere close enough to hear me moving around. I reached the thermostat and discovered that it had no power. Then I realized the entire upstairs seemed dead. No lights, no working electronics, nothing. I looked through an upstairs window to see whether the neighborhood had lost power. Every house around mine looked normal. Outdoor lights were still glowing. The street looked completely ordinary. From the moment I woke up to that point, only a short amount of time had passed. I decided to go downstairs and get some water. As I approached the staircase, I noticed a strange glow coming from the first floor. That made no sense. The upstairs appeared to have no electricity, yet something downstairs was producing light. I started descending the stairs. Then I heard a sound. It was a faint hum with a high-pitched tone, mixed with occasional lower pulses. The best comparison I can make is a distant motor being turned up and down, except the sound was smoother and more mechanical. As I moved farther down the staircase, I saw a dark figure moving slowly inside the room where the light was coming from. I took another step, then everything changed. It felt as though the floor disappeared beneath me. Not like I tripped, not like I fainted. It felt more like I had stepped off the edge of something or been pulled downward through the staircase itself. Every sensation in my body vanished, and then there was nothing. My next memory was waking up in bed to the sound of my phone alarm. Everything was normal again. The cats were lying nearby, as if nothing had happened. My phone worked. The power was on. At first, I sat there trying to convince myself that I had dreamed the entire thing. But then I checked the security system. The system had been disarmed during the night. I knew I had armed it before going to bed. The activity log also showed that the front door had opened and closed multiple times. I pulled up the recordings from my exterior security cameras. There was footage from before I went to sleep. Then there was nothing. No motion clips. No people. No vehicles stopping. Just a gap. The next recording was from the following morning. That bothered me enough that I asked the neighbor across the street to check his cameras. His system pointed toward my house, so if anyone had walked through my front door, his cameras should have caught something. I made up a story and told him I thought somebody might have broken into my truck. He checked. Then he told me something strange. His cameras had the same kind of gap. There was footage before the incident and footage afterward, but nothing during the period when my system showed the door opening and closing. At that point, my first explanation was sleepwalking. Maybe I had gotten up, disarmed the system, opened the door, wandered around, and somehow forgotten everything. But one detail kept bothering me. When I looked out the window during the night, I clearly remembered a red pickup truck parked across the street, facing the wrong direction. I always notice cars parked that way because I once received a ticket for doing the same thing. The truck was not visible in the earlier recordings. It was visible again in the morning. So whatever else happened, that detail matched the real world. I had been awake enough to notice something that was actually there. Other things in the house were different too. The security system was disarmed. A downstairs light was on, even though I knew I had turned it off. My entire body smelled strangely sweet and burned, almost like scorched marshmallows. And then there was the fish tank. I had a large aquarium near the bottom of the stairs. A huge amount of water was missing from it. Not a small leak, a massive amount. Enough that there should have been water all over the floor. But the area around the tank was completely dry. The fish were alive. The glass was not broken. There was no obvious leak. I had no explanation for where the water went. So I was left with a house that lost power only in certain areas. Missing security footage from 2 different camera systems. A front door that opened and closed during the night. A security system that somehow became disarmed. A light that turned on by itself. Cats that vanished from my awareness and then reappeared. A strange figure near a glowing room. A missing block of memory. An unexplained smell on my body and a fish tank that had somehow lost a large amount of water without spilling it anywhere. I know how ridiculous that sounds. I know there are explanations people could offer. A power malfunction, a software failure, sleepwalking, a dream, a camera glitch, a plumbing problem I somehow missed. Maybe several ordinary things happened at once. But when I put everything together, it still doesn't feel ordinary. Sometimes I joke that maybe some thirsty visitors stopped by and borrowed the water. Honestly, humor is easier than admitting how unsettled the whole thing still makes me. Because the one part I can never explain is that dark figure on the first floor. I remember seeing it. I remember taking that step, and I remember the sensation that followed. Then nothing. For about a year, I went through a series of experiences I still cannot fully explain. It started while I was working far from home on a temporary project. The crew was staying in a motel outside the nearest large town. Somehow, I ended up with one of the better rooms, with a large bed, extra couches, and enough space that it almost felt like a small apartment. Our work days were long. I used one of the couches as a place to stack clean clothes, mostly jeans, hoodies, and work shirts. I had brought my desktop computer with me because I was going to be there for a while. One night, I was sitting at the computer having a serious argument with my ex through online messages. I remember typing. I remember being angry. I remember being in the middle of a sentence. Then I opened my eyes. I was sitting on top of the pile of hoodies on the couch. Hours had passed. I rushed back to the computer. The unfinished sentence was still sitting there exactly where I had stopped typing. My ex had sent message after message asking why I had suddenly disappeared. There were missed calls and texts on my phone. The phone was still sitting beside the computer mouse. I tried to convince myself I had simply fallen asleep. But that didn't explain why I was sitting upright on top of folded clothes across the room. I had a perfectly good bed only a few steps away. Nothing else happened for a little while. Then another incident occurred. My routine after work was simple. I would return to the motel, shower, change clothes, then drive into town to find somewhere still open for dinner. One night, I followed that routine. I showered. I got dressed. I picked up my keys. I walked outside. Then I sat in my car and turned the ignition. The moment the dashboard came on, something felt wrong. I checked the clock. Several hours were missing. I had no memory of what had happened between getting ready to leave the motel and sitting in the car. My body felt wrong too. I don't know how else to describe it. I felt violated. Not injured in any obvious way. Not in pain. Just deeply, instinctively wrong. Like waking from something terrible without being able to remember what happened. I stayed awake for the rest of the night trying to make sense of it. If I had fainted, where? If I had fallen asleep, why was I in the car? Why did I have no memory of leaving the room? Why did my body react as though something had happened to me? The rest of the work project passed without another major incident. I went home and tried to forget about it. For a while, nothing unusual happened. Then my sleep began to change. I started waking in the middle of the night with an overwhelming need to turn on every light in the apartment. I couldn't relax again until daylight. It wasn't ordinary insomnia. I would wake up with the immediate feeling that I should not remain asleep. I would walk from room to room, switching on lights, checking windows, finding pointless things to do, and waiting for sunrise before finally feeling safe enough to lie down again. Then the dreams started. Strangers would appear in them and tell me to wake up. Not people I knew, never family, never friends, always strangers. Sometimes they spoke calmly, other times they became aggressive. If I ignored them, they found ways to interrupt whatever was happening in the dream. Wake up! You need to wake up! It's important. Wake up now. One dream was especially vivid. In the dream, I had dressed nicely and driven to an expensive hotel. I had no idea why I was there. Once I reached the room, someone began knocking on the door. The knocking continued. A voice outside kept calling to me. Then the telephone rang. I answered it. A voice on the other end told me not to open the door. I argued that someone was standing outside, and I needed to see who it was. The voice became more urgent. Do not open the door. I finally hung up. I walked toward the door. I opened it, and instantly I woke up in bed, sweating and terrified. I could not go back to sleep. Other dreams followed the same pattern. There would be a sudden burst of brilliant white light. It didn't matter whether the dream took place indoors or outside. It didn't matter whether it was night or broad daylight. The flash would overwhelm everything. Once, I dreamed I was standing outside under a bright, sunny sky. A white flash appeared that was somehow brighter than the sun itself. Then a stranger ran toward me. Wake up! That light is not part of your dream. You need to wake. There is something deeply unsettling about a person inside your own dream telling you that you are dreaming. It feels even worse when they insist that something else has entered the dream from outside. Another strange pattern developed. Before these dreams, I often experience a sudden, overwhelming urge to go to sleep. It wasn't normal tiredness. I could be eating, playing a game, watching television, or doing something active, and suddenly my entire body would seem to shut down. I would put down whatever was in my hands and walk toward the bedroom almost automatically. Sometimes I left lights on. Sometimes the television stayed running. Sometimes food sat unfinished. It felt like becoming a sleepwalking version of myself while I was still awake. I could barely resist it. But almost every time I surrendered to that feeling, I would wake again in the middle of the night and remain awake until sunrise. Then something happened during a road trip with a friend. We stopped at a motel for the night. At some point, I heard knocking at the door. A voice kept calling out in exactly the same way as the hotel dream. Hello, hello, hello. My friend was asleep and did not react. I got out of bed and walked toward the door. I remember unlocking it. Then my memory stops. I woke later, sitting in a chair near the desk. The door was locked. Nothing appeared to be missing. There was no sign anyone had entered. I woke my friend and asked whether he had heard the knocking. He had not. When I explained that I thought I had opened the door to a stranger, he became angry and frightened, but we had no proof that anyone had ever been there. The only thing we knew was that I had somehow moved from the bed to the chair and lost the memory of how it happened. After that, I became afraid of sleep. The episodes did not happen every night. Sometimes there were several in a week. Sometimes nothing happened for a while. But the unpredictability made it worse. I began keeping every blind closed. I left lights on. Some nights I fought sleep until morning and slept during the day instead. Eventually, I noticed something. Whenever that unnatural wave of drowsiness hit me, I would force myself to leave the apartment and drive toward the busiest part of the city. Crowded streets, bright stores, traffic, people everywhere. The moment I reached a place full of activity, the urge to sleep disappeared. So I started doing it every time. If I suddenly felt compelled to lie down, I went downtown. If I felt watched, I went downtown. If the apartment felt wrong, I left. It damaged my work schedule and made my life exhausting. But after I kept doing it, the experiences gradually stopped. The dreams disappeared. The bright flashes stopped. The strangers telling me to wake up never returned. The sudden waves of forced sleep went away. Years have passed without another major episode, but some things never completely left me. I still struggle to sleep before sunrise. I still check blinds obsessively and cannot stand leaving even a narrow gap. And something else happened that I didn't expect. Images of the classic gray alien began terrifying me. Not realistic images, even cartoons. A simple drawing can trigger a wave of panic. That never happened before these experiences. I have no memory of being physically abducted. I cannot honestly say that happened. I only know that I lost time on more than one occasion. I had dreams in which strangers seemed to warn me that something was wrong. I experienced bright flashes that felt separate from the dreams themselves. I felt watched. I felt compelled to sleep. I woke in places where I did not remember falling asleep. And once I began actively resisting those urges by going into crowded public places, everything stopped. Most people I have told don't know what to say. One man I met at a party told me about his own alleged abduction experience. After hearing my story, he became convinced that something had been taking me repeatedly and eventually stopped because I had made myself too difficult to isolate. Maybe he was right. Maybe he won. He wasn't. I still don't know. I don't remember a spacecraft. I don't remember a room. I don't remember being standing over me. But I remember the missing time. I remember the feeling of being watched. And more than anything, I remember waking up with the absolute certainty that something had happened to me, even though my mind refused to tell me what it was. During college, I had an experience that still sits in a strange place in my memory, because I cannot prove what happened. Yet, several details have never made sense to me. My dorm room was connected to my roommate's room in such a way that I had to pass through her space to reach the bathroom or hallway. She was a light sleeper. I was not someone who stayed out late. So normally, that arrangement did not cause problems. There was another detail about me that later seemed important. I had undergone routine medical procedures before and discovered that I reacted unusually to anesthesia. I tended to wake up earlier than expected. My body also healed slowly from small injuries. Even something as simple as a mosquito bite could remain visible for a long time. Then one night I had the most vivid dream of my life, except it did not feel like a normal dream. I remember opening my eyes somewhere else. I was lying on what looked like a hospital gurney, tilted slightly upward and facing a wall. I looked to the left, then to the right. Rows of empty gurneys stretched beside me. The room sounded enormous. There was an ambient mechanical noise behind me, and the echo suggested a large open space. Nothing sounded chaotic. Nothing sounded violent. At the foot of the gurney, slightly to one side, two figures were sitting together on a bench. One looked like an ordinary person wearing a dark suit. The other was small. I could not clearly see its face, but I noticed its hands. The skin looked darker than human skin, almost gray. The two were speaking animatedly, like old friends excited to see each other. They did not notice that I had opened my eyes. The language they were using was completely unfamiliar. I have heard many common languages before, even if I cannot speak them. This sounded like none of them, yet the person in the dark suit seemed perfectly fluent. I looked at them only briefly. Then I slipped back into unconsciousness, almost exactly the way I had during medical anesthesia. The next morning, I woke in my dorm room and immediately dismissed it as a bizarre dream. I got up and went toward the shower. As I passed through my roommate's room, she looked at me from bed and asked a question that stopped me. "Where did you go last night?" I thought that was strange. I didn't remember going anywhere. After showering, I began getting ready for the day. While looking into the mirror, I noticed something on my face. There were two extremely thin, perfectly parallel lines on the skin. They looked almost impossibly precise. A clear, hardened substance covered the surface. There was no dried blood, no swelling, no messy edge. The lines were thinner than my own hair, yet I could see that the skin had been cut. I stared at them, trying to find an ordinary explanation. Maybe I had slept on a staple. Maybe a paperclip had scratched me. Maybe something sharp had been left on the pillow. I searched the bed carefully. Nothing. Then, because I wanted to understand what kind of object could make such a precise mark, I compared several ordinary sharp items. Every small scratch I tested produced an immediate reaction. The skin became red. Tiny amounts of blood appeared. The edges looked uneven. Nothing resembled the two perfectly straight marks already on my face. I became obsessed with them. I skipped part of my normal routine and spent hours trying to decide what I should do. Photography was not as easy then as it is now. I did not have a camera ready in my pocket. To document the cuts, I would have had to borrow one, explain the situation to someone else, wait for the film to be developed, and then decide who I could possibly show the pictures to. And what would I say? I had a strange dream. My roommate thought I had left during the night. I woke with two impossible cuts on my face. At the time, even mentioning aliens could make people treat you like you had lost your mind. I sat on the edge of my bed debating it for hours. Eventually, exhaustion won. I went through the rest of my day. Later, I fell asleep. When I woke again, the cuts were gone. Not faded. Gone. No redness. No scar. No trace. That bothered me for a while. Then life moved on. Eventually, I pushed the whole thing out of my mind. Years later, I went to a dentist for some work. I visited more than one office because I wanted different opinions and estimates. At the first office, they took a full facial X-ray. I had almost completely forgotten the dream and the cuts. Then I saw something strange on the image. Above the teeth, on the same side of my face where the marks had appeared, there was a small shape. It looked almost square. I asked the technician whether the image was reversed. He said it was not. The right side of the image matched the right side of my face. I pointed to the square and asked what it was. He barely reacted. He called it an X-ray anomaly. I assumed he meant the film, sensor, or machine had produced some kind of flaw. So I let it go. Then I went to another dental office. They took another full facial X-ray. The square was there again. Same side, same place, same shape. This time I asked immediately, "What is that?" The technician looked at me strangely. Then she gave me the same answer, an X-ray anomaly. After a pause, she leaned closer and quietly added that they saw things like that all the time. The way she said it gave me chills. Maybe there is an ordinary explanation. Maybe two different machines created similar artifacts. Maybe I misunderstood what I was looking at. I am not an expert on X-rays, but after the second image, I started thinking again about that night in the dorm. The strange room, the person in the dark suit, the small figure, the language I could not recognize, my roommate asking where I had gone, the cuts on my face, the impossible speed with which they healed, and now, a small unexplained shape appearing in the same area on more than one image. I began wondering whether something might actually be inside my face. Oddly enough, the possibility does not terrify me as much as people might expect. I started thinking about the way human beings treat animals in scientific research. We track wildlife, we tranquilize them, we take blood, we attach tags, we measure them, we release them. From our perspective, the goal may be conservation, research, or protection. But the animal has no idea what is happening. It does not understand the helicopter. It does not understand the needle. It does not understand the tag in its ear. It only knows that something stronger than it has taken control. If what happened to me was real, I cannot say whether it was malicious. In the memory, I was not in pain. I was not being chased. I was not being threatened. If I had not reacted strangely to anesthesia, maybe I would never have opened my eyes at all. The marks on my face healed with extraordinary speed, and in that strange room, there seemed to be a human representative, or at least someone who looked human. Maybe that interpretation is completely wrong. Maybe it was just a dream followed by unrelated medical oddities. But sometimes I wonder whether the whole thing was more like research than an attack. Something done for observation, data collection, tracking, the way we do to animals every day. Would I have preferred to be asked for permission? Of course. But then I think about the strangest possibility of all. How do you ask for consent when the people you are studying are not even supposed to know you exist? When I was a child, I lived in a rural area, surrounded by farmland, woods, and open sky. I used to see strange lights sometimes. One night, I was standing on the front porch, looking across the pasture. At first, I thought I was looking at the full moon. Then it started getting larger. It moved sideways over the tree line. I turned around and ran inside to get my older brother. By the time we came back, it was gone. He thought I had been playing some kind of joke on him and punched me in the arm. Not long afterward, I went camping alone in the woods on our property. We lived on hundreds of acres, so wandering deep into the trees was normal for me. I had grown up around those woods. I was comfortable there. I took 2 dogs with me, a Walker Hound and an Australian Shepherd, along with basic camping gear and a small rifle. I walked until I found a nice clearing beside a creek. I set up camp. As darkness came, I started a fire. Then the dogs began acting strangely. The Walker Hound became especially loud and agitated. I remember hearing him barking. Then my memory skips. The next thing I knew, I was inside the tent. It was very early. The sky had only just begun to brighten. The fire was completely dead. The tent was partly open. The Walker Hound was gone. The Australian Shepherd was outside the tent whining. Immediately, I knew something was wrong. I stood up and became sick beside the tent. I still had my clothes on, but my boots were on the wrong feet. When I took them off to fix them, I realized my socks were wet. That frightened me more than I can explain. I had spent most of my childhood outdoors. I knew what it felt like to be alone in the woods. I knew the sounds animals made. I knew how darkness felt. I had never experienced that kind of fear there before. I grabbed the rifle and left everything else. The tent, the supplies, whatever I had brought. I ran. The Australian shepherd ran with me. Neither of us slowed down until we reached the open pasture near home. The moment I saw the house, I felt a wave of relief. My mother was waiting. The second she saw me, she grabbed me and started crying. My father and brothers had already gone out searching. The Walker hound had returned home during the night without me. That dog had never willingly left my side since I had gotten him as a puppy. When he showed up alone, barking and agitated, my family knew something was wrong. My mother went to the old family vehicle and used the horn to signal that I had returned, so the others searching the property would know I was safe. I told her what I remembered: the fire, the barking, then waking in the tent with missing time and my boots on the wrong feet. Nobody knew what to make of it. A few days later, I noticed something on my ankles. There were 2 small puncture marks on one side. They looked almost like tiny fang marks. Then I checked the other ankle. There was an identical pair in the exact same location. That was when another old memory came back. When I had been much younger, my mother had once found me outside near the mailbox during the night. I had apparently been sleepwalking. No one knew how I had gotten out of the house without waking anybody. Around that same period, similar marks had appeared. I cannot say what happened to me in those woods. Maybe I walked around while half asleep. Maybe I became disoriented. Maybe the dogs reacted to an animal. Maybe there's an explanation for the wet socks, the missing time, and the boots. But I will never forget the feeling I had when I woke up. It was not the ordinary fear of being a child alone in the forest. It felt deeper than that. It felt like something had happened during the part I could not remember. And somehow, my dog knew it too. My father used to tell me a story with such a serious expression that I could never tell whether I was hearing family folklore or something he truly believed had happened. Years later, I asked my grandmother. She remembered it too. At the time, my grandparents were living in a remote part of Michigan, surrounded by trees and quiet country roads. Their children were staying with relatives for a short visit, giving my grandparents a rare chance to spend some peaceful time alone. When my grandfather returned home after dropping the children off, the house felt unusually dark. Not simply dark because the lights were off. It had that heavy, uncomfortable feeling that makes you suddenly aware of every empty room around you. Even so, the evening passed normally. They went to bed. Then, during the night, bright flashes suddenly filled the bedroom through a small window. Both of them woke immediately. They went into the kitchen and approached the back door. My grandfather told my grandmother to stay behind him while he opened it. Outside, a pattern of brilliant colored lights hovered just above the ground. The lights seemed arranged around a strangely shaped object. As his eyes adjusted, my grandfather realized the lights were attached to some kind of craft. He described it as rounded and elongated, almost like a strangely shaped football. It was small enough to fit between the trees, but large enough that several people could have been inside. The light made it difficult to tell what the outer material looked like. Then he saw something moving toward the house. It walked on 2 legs. Its body was roughly human in shape. It appeared unclothed, though he could not see any obvious sexual features. The head was elongated. The eyes were unusually large. From a distance, he thought the being might almost have passed for a severely unusual-looking human. It walked toward my grandfather and raised one hand, but it did not wave from side to side. It simply held the hand upright and still, almost as if offering a greeting it expected him to understand. My grandfather froze. Then my grandmother stepped outside behind him. Seeing the expression on her face convinced him that he was not dreaming. The first being lowered its hand. A second similar figure appeared from the craft. It carried a flat, round object. The second being handed it to the first, who then held it toward my grandparents. My grandfather nervously reached for it. The being pulled it back. Then it offered the object to my grandmother instead. She hesitated. She looked at her husband. Finally, she accepted it. The object was soft, flat, and round, something like a large pancake. Another similar piece was produced. The beings began eating their own. Then they looked at my grandparents as though waiting for them to do the same. Without really knowing why, my grandparents tore off pieces and tasted them. They described the food as grain-based, somewhat like wheat, but unfamiliar in flavor and texture. It seemed close enough to ordinary food to recognize, yet not exactly like anything they knew. Once the visitors saw them eat it, the beings raised their hands in the same still greeting. Then they returned to the craft. A platform disappeared inside. The lights began to fade. The object rose and vanished into the night sky. Whenever I heard the story, I always asked the same questions. What happened to the rest of the food? Did you save it? Did you call anyone? Did you give it to the government? My grandparents always gave essentially the same answer. At the time, they believed that telling people such a story would only make everyone think they were crazy. So they kept it within the family. And that is where the story stayed. Maybe it was a family legend that became more elaborate over time. Maybe my grandparents misunderstood something they saw. Or maybe, on one quiet night in rural Michigan, two people stepped outside and shared food with visitors they could not explain. I do not know whether what happened to my friend and me should be called an abduction. I only know that something happened to both of us, and the amount of time that disappeared has never made sense. We were teenagers. Almost every night, a friend I will call Mason, and I would sneak out after our families were asleep. We would spend hours talking, wandering around the neighborhood, and then return before anyone woke up. One night, not long after we had slipped outside, we went into my backyard and lay on a trampoline. We stared at the stars and talked like we always did. Then the sky changed. That is the only way I know how to describe it. Imagine standing inside a room and looking at the corners where the walls meet the ceiling. You can see the sharp edges. You can see the separate flat surfaces. For one impossible moment, the sky looked like that. Instead of a smooth, endless dome, it seemed divided into enormous geometric planes, almost like we were looking at the inside of a gigantic cube. Then something entered our view. It was enormous, not simply large. It seemed to occupy a huge portion of the visible sky. Mason and I both stared at it. Neither of us spoke. The object moved silently. Parts of it appeared to rotate, but not the way a disc or spinning toy would rotate. The outer structure seemed to turn, while the whole object continued gliding in a steady direction. We watched without saying a word. Then again, without speaking or even looking at each other, we both rolled onto our stomachs. At exactly the same moment, we flattened ourselves against the trampoline. That part still bothers me. Hiding from something overhead is understandable. But this did not feel like two people separately having the same instinct. It felt coordinated. I remember a thought moving through my mind with absolute certainty. Stay flat. Do not move. It will not see us. I cannot prove Mason heard the same thing, but our actions were perfectly synchronized. We stayed still as the object moved across the sky in a strange, curved path. The entire event felt slow, almost suspended. Then the craft disappeared from view, and suddenly it was daylight. Not dawn beginning, full morning light. That is the part neither of us could explain. We had only recently gone outside. I had checked the time. Then, after what felt like only a few minutes watching the object, several hours had vanished. The moment we realized how bright the sky had become, we looked at each other. I do not remember us discussing what had happened. We simply ran. Each of us rushed home before our families noticed we had been gone. For a long time, I avoided thinking too deeply about it. Later, I told my brother's girlfriend. She was very interested in unidentified flying object stories and took the subject much more seriously than I did. When I explained that the sighting had seemed to last only minutes, but that many hours were suddenly missing, her expression changed. She told me she thought Mason and I might have been abducted. I laughed and joked about going through hypnosis to recover hidden memories. She did not laugh. She told me not to do it casually. She said some people who believe they have recovered memories of alleged abductions describe severe trauma afterward. That conversation stayed with me. I do not know whether anything happened during the missing time. I do not remember a craft landing. I do not remember beings. I do not remember leaving the trampoline. All I remember is lying there with Mason, seeing the impossible shape of the sky, watching an enormous silent object move overhead, feeling that strange shared command to stay flat, and then discovering that night had somehow turned into morning. Maybe there is an explanation. Maybe memory distorted the event. Maybe we both fell asleep and somehow forgot. But I have never understood how two people could apparently experience the same strange sequence together and then lose the same block of time. Whatever happened, I know one thing. When I think back to that night, the strongest memory is not fear. It is the feeling that, for a few minutes, the world around us stopped behaving like the world we knew. I was camping in the mountains of northern Georgia with a group of friends. Heavy rain started coming down, so most of the group abandoned their tents in the woods and rented one of the small cabins at the campground. I was exhausted from kayaking all day. Everyone else wanted to stay awake talking, so I decided to sleep in my car. Later, I woke up. The rain had stopped. The inside of the car had become cold, and I realized my sleeping bag was still in my tent. I checked the cabin first. The lights were on, but everyone inside was asleep. There was not enough room to lie down comfortably without waking people. So I took a small flashlight and headed back toward the tents. Mine was the farthest away. I had to pass all the others before reaching it. And there was a noticeable stretch of empty ground between my tent and the next closest one. I crawled inside, wrapped myself in the sleeping bag, and tried to get a little more rest before sunrise. I had only been there a short while when I heard whispering. It was directly outside the tent. The voices were quiet. At first, I assumed some of my friends had followed me into the woods. Then I listened more carefully. The language made no sense. It did not sound like English. It did not sound like any language I could recognize. Almost at the same moment, two lights appeared outside the fabric of the tent. They were not ordinary flashlight beams. The glow did not move the way a handheld light should. The two lights also seemed different from each other, though I could never clearly describe their colors. The whispers continued. Then the voices began sounding more intense, almost as though the speakers were arguing. Still quiet, still breathy, but faster. The lights began moving around the tent, behind me, beside me, in front of me, then around again. There were no footsteps. That was when I became truly afraid. If people were circling the tent, I should have heard leaves moving, shoes on dirt, branches snapping. There was nothing, only the whispering and the lights. I sat up and knelt on the floor of the tent. Every horror movie I had ever seen suddenly felt real. I kept staring at the zipper, expecting it to open. My mind raced through every option. Run, hide, yell, fight, stay completely still. The lights moved faster. The voices became more urgent. I was sweating, even though the air was cold. Then everything stopped. Instantly, the lights vanished as if someone had flipped a switch. The voices disappeared at exactly the same moment. Silence. Not fading, not moving away. Gone. I stayed frozen in place. I did not leave that tent until daylight. To this day, it remains one of the most frightening experiences of my life. Years later, I attended the premiere of a horror film. During one scene, I heard voices that sounded almost identical to the whispers from that night. The moment I heard them, goosebumps covered my arms. I was suddenly back in that tent. Cold air, dark woods, two impossible lights, and voices outside speaking a language I had never heard before, and somehow never forgotten. I'm not completely sure whether what I experienced should be called a humanoid encounter or an unusually vivid series of dreams. The reason I hesitate is simple. I have had dreams all my life. These did not feel like them. In ordinary dreams, I often feel carried along by whatever is happening. In these experiences, I felt completely present. I could make choices. I could smell the room. I could feel fear in my body. And I remembered details with a clarity that ordinary dreams rarely leave behind. The first experience happened when I was still young and regularly staying at my great-grandparents' house in rural northwestern Georgia. Their home sat near the end of a quiet road with only a handful of houses nearby. One night I woke up thirsty. I got out of bed and walked down the long hallway toward the living room, which connected directly to the kitchen. As I approached the open entrance to the living room, something felt wrong. It was not one specific thing at first. The whole atmosphere seemed altered. Time felt slower. Moonlight coming through the windows looked slightly unnatural. There was also a yellowish glow in the room, as though the lights were on, except the color was not quite the same as the familiar lighting I had grown up with. I stepped around the corner. That was when I saw them. In the middle of the living room stood a very tall figure wearing a dark cloak. On either side were two much smaller figures. The smaller ones were difficult to focus on. Whenever I tried to look directly at them, they seemed to fade into something almost like television static. The closest comparison I can make is a drawing that suddenly becomes scribbled over while you are still looking at it. My eyes moved from the tall figure to the smaller ones. As soon as I tried to focus on them, they seemed to disappear. The tall figure reacted. It turned toward me. From behind, it had already looked impossibly tall, almost reaching the ceiling. It appeared slightly hunched, as though the room was too small. But when it turned, it seemed even taller. The strangest detail was that, from behind, the cloak seemed to end at the height of an ordinary tall person. When the figure faced me, however, a head seemed to exist above that point, almost as though part of it had not been visible from the back. The moment it looked at me, the entire room seemed to distort. The feeling that something was wrong became overwhelming. Sound faded. I became aware of a smell. Years later, after spending time visiting a dying relative in the hospital and attending a funeral, I finally recognized it. It was the smell associated with places where people are very sick or close to death. Not necessarily a rotten smell, more like something heavy and clinical, a smell that seems to make the air itself feel thicker. Then I realized I could not move. I could not speak. I could not scream. I felt completely paralyzed. At the same time, a powerful thought entered my mind. I should not be here, not simply in the room. I should not be present at that exact place and moment. Then I saw the figure's face. It resembled what people commonly describe as a gray alien. But the skin was unnaturally pale, not glowing, not bright, just a flat, almost colorless white. There was no hair. The head was enlarged. The mouth was small. The nose was little more than openings. But the eyes were what terrified me. They were dark and almond-shaped. Looking at them felt wrong in a way I cannot explain. They did not seem to belong in the same physical reality as everything around them. It was almost like looking at an object from a different dimension, forced into a form my eyes could barely understand. The figure stared at me. For a moment, it looked surprised that I was there. Then one long arm emerged from beneath the cloak. The fingers were thin and elongated. The figure bent toward me. Its face moved closer. Its mouth seemed to widen slightly. The hand reached forward. The instant it touched my face, I lost consciousness. I woke the next morning on the living room couch. That terrified me. I had gone to sleep in a bedroom down the hallway. I remembered getting up for water. I remembered the figure. Yet somehow I woke on the couch. I went back into the bedroom and crawled under the blankets. I stayed there until I heard my great-grandmother cooking breakfast. Only then did I feel safe enough to come out. The experience stayed with me for a long time afterward. I dreamed about the tall figure. The dreams were especially frequent after the first encounter. Eventually, they became less common. Then after a long period, I saw it again. I woke during the night and decided to go to the kitchen for a drink. Partway down the hallway, the memory of the first encounter suddenly returned with full force. I stopped. The same feeling was there. That sense that the room ahead was wrong. I tried to turn around. I could not. something seemed to compel me forward. The strangest part was that, at the same time, I suddenly felt calm. I knew what I expected to see, and somehow, I accepted it. The tall figure was waiting in the living room. This time it was alone. It already faced the hallway as though it knew exactly where I would appear. There was no smell. Instead, I heard a low humming sound that seemed to come from outside. The figure looked more approachable than before. I still felt afraid, but not overwhelmed. It studied me. I remember what looked almost like a small smile. Then it raised a hand. It touched me. Everything went black. Again, I woke on the couch. This time, instead of pure terror, I felt curiosity. Why me? What was happening during the missing part? Why did the same figure keep appearing? I also had the powerful sense that the encounters were not finished, that I would see it again whether I wanted to or not. Over the years, the figure continued appearing in dreams. I moved to different homes. The dreams followed. Sometimes months passed between them. Sometimes several happened close together. Once, after repeated dreams, I decided I would stay awake in the living room and wait. I wanted to see whether anything would actually happen. I remember sitting there. Then I woke in an impossible position. My upper body was partly on the floor. My lower back rested against the edge of the couch. My legs were raised awkwardly. Blankets were scattered around me. I had no memory of falling asleep or moving into that position. I wondered whether whatever had happened had simply occurred before I could become aware of it. I still do not know what the tall figure is. I do not know whether it exists outside my mind. I do not know why the experiences began. I do not know what happens during the moments. I cannot remember. What I know is that the first encounter felt more real than any ordinary dream. I remember the room, the smell, the paralysis, the face, the hand, and the feeling that something far more important than my physical safety was at risk. For one brief moment, even though I was not religious, I felt as though I had a soul, and I felt as though that figure could erase it. The fear has lessened over time. The confusion has not. In one of the recurring dreams, the hooded figure seemed to communicate one simple idea. We would meet again, and a part of me still believes it. I was riding in the backseat of a car with 3 friends on a cold night in New Hampshire. We were traveling along a long, winding road toward my house. Suddenly, the friend who was driving reacted. "What is that?" The person in the passenger seat began repeating the same stunned phrase over and over. Oh my God. Those of us in the back leaned forward, trying to see. Then a bright light appeared directly ahead of the car. It seemed to expand, becoming larger and brighter, then shrink again until it nearly disappeared. The driver slowed almost to a crawl. We all looked upward. Several more lights were doing the same thing. They would grow until they looked as bright and intense as powerful searchlights. Then they would contract into tiny points and vanish. We pulled over at a shared driveway on a hill overlooking a reservoir. The reservoir was frozen solid. There was no mist rising from open water, no obvious weather effect, no nearby source that could explain what we were seeing. The 4 of us got out of the car. The cold was brutal, but curiosity was stronger. High above us were large, elongated lights. There seemed to be many of them. They looked almost like glowing lenses suspended in the sky. They drifted slowly in different directions. Some became brighter, some dimmed. Then we noticed smaller lights. They looked roughly like bright stars. They emerged from the sides of the larger objects in groups. The small lights moved incredibly fast. They traveled from side to side. They stopped suddenly. They changed direction instantly. Some zigzagged in patterns that did not look like aircraft movements. Others appeared to move together, almost as if they were interacting. Then they would return toward the larger lights, while new groups emerged elsewhere. The sky seemed busy, alive with movement. The best way I can describe it is that the smaller lights looked as though they were dancing around the larger ones. We stood there for a long time. Eventually, the cold became too much. My friends drove me home because the long driveway to my house was icy and poorly maintained. They left me near the bottom. Rather than risk getting the car stuck, I watched their taillights disappear. Then I looked back at the sky. From where I stood, trees blocked much of the view. I could no longer see the strange lights. That was when fear hit me. Not mild nervousness, a sudden, overwhelming panic. Until then, I had been surrounded by friends. Now, I was alone in the darkness, with half a mile of icy driveway between me and the house. I ran. I did not care about slipping. I did not care about making noise. I just wanted to get inside. For the next few days, my friends and I talked about what we had seen. We were shocked, but strangely, we did not tell many other people. At least I did not. Eventually, we stopped discussing it altogether. Years later, I met up with some of those friends again. By then, I had started wondering whether I had exaggerated the memory. Maybe I had dreamed part of it. Maybe I had somehow combined several events in my mind. I finally asked them, "Do you remember those lights?" They did. Not vaguely. They remembered the same details. The large, elongated lights, the smaller objects coming out of them, the rapid movements, the way they stopped and changed direction, the way we stood in the freezing cold watching. We were almost embarrassed to talk about it, but the shared memory was still there. I do not know what we saw. I only know that 4 people stood on a frozen hill in New Hampshire and watched something in the sky that none of us could explain. When I was a kid, my mother took me on a day trip to visit one of her old friends. I brought a handheld game system because her friend had children around my age, and I was excited to show them a racing game I had gotten good at. At some point, my mother and her friend told me to leave the room because they needed to discuss adult things. Naturally, that made me curious. I stayed close enough to overhear part of the conversation. My mother's friend was talking about her young daughter. The girl had begun sleepwalking after the family moved into a newer neighborhood in Northern California. The area was suburban, but still unfinished. There were empty houses and patches of woods between some of the developments. One night, the parents found their daughter sitting alone in the backyard. She had no memory of going outside. After that, they became afraid she might wander into the woods or onto the road. They began locking her bedroom door at night and making sure the windows were secured so she could not leave while sleepwalking. Then something happened that neither parent could explain. During the night, they woke to a tremendous impact against the side of the house. The whole building seemed to shake. They immediately checked on their sons. The boys were fine. They had barely noticed anything. Then the parents went to the daughter's room. They unlocked the door. She was gone. Panic set in. The windows were still secured. There was no obvious sign that anyone had forced their way inside. Then someone knocked on the front door. The parents opened it. Their little girl was standing outside. She looked tired, but not frightened. They asked where she had been. She calmly said she had been with the men. Then she pointed down the street. Her father looked and saw 2 figures wearing long coats walking away. He shouted at them and ran after them. According to the mother, the 2 figures did not react. They simply continued walking. They turned a corner. The father reached the same corner only moments later. No one was there. The men had vanished. The parents searched the house again. Doors, windows, locks. Nothing appeared damaged. They called the police. Officers could not find evidence of a break-in and had no clear explanation for how the child had left a locked room. The girl herself was calm. She did not act traumatized. She only seemed sleepy. Soon, she went back to bed. That was the story my mother and her friend were discussing when they thought the children were out of earshot. I have no idea who the men were. I do not know whether the child somehow escaped the room on her own. Maybe the parents missed something simple. Maybe the figures down the street were unrelated. But one part of the story always stayed with me. The girl did not say she had been lost. She did not say she had gone outside. She said she had been with the men, and somehow no one could explain how she had left the locked room in the first place. I would not say with confidence that aliens abducted me. But I do believe something happened to my consciousness and possibly to my body too. I was sitting in a quiet park with several friends in a small Midwestern community. It was broad daylight. We were talking together when something changed. Everyone began moving more slowly. Then they stopped completely. I stopped too. I could not move. I could not speak. I could not even blink. Breathing required effort and concentration. Then everything went black. When I became aware again, I was somewhere else. The room was almost completely dark. Around me were 3 large glowing screens. Each screen showed the park from above. I could see the exact place where my friends and I had been sitting. It felt as though I remained in that room for hours. Then I blacked out again. When I finally came back to myself, I was on the ground in the park. I had been crying uncontrollably. My friends looked shaken too. Nobody seemed normal. For a few moments, we just stared at each other. I was the first to speak. I said that I thought I had met God. The others responded with strange, brief statements of their own. One girl said she thought we were on television somewhere. Another expressed the feeling that we had been watched. The exact words are harder to remember than the shared emotion. Violation, exposure, fear, the sense that we had all been taken somewhere we could not understand. The strangest part was what happened next. We did not talk about it. Not really. Each person said one short sentence. Then we stopped. It felt almost as though discussing it openly was forbidden, as though whatever had watched us might still be watching. We left the park immediately. Over time, I lost contact with those friends. We never sat down together and compared memories. I still wonder whether they remember the same dark room, the same screens, the same feeling of being pulled out of ordinary reality. Maybe it was some kind of shared psychological event. Maybe there is an explanation involving fear, altered perception, or memory. I honestly do not know. But whatever happened, it happened to several of us at once, and every one of us seemed to return with the same unspoken certainty. For a brief period, we had been somewhere else. My strange experiences began when I was very young. At first, they did not feel frightening. They felt more like recurring dreams. I would sneak downstairs into the living room, stand in front of a large window, and make a strange call. Then a huge wolf-like head would appear outside. It would answer me. After that, my memory would end. The next thing I knew, I would be waking up again. My parents never caught me leaving bed, but sometimes leaves or dirt appeared on the living room floor, and no one understood how it got there. When we moved from the countryside into the suburbs, the experiences changed. I became terrified of sleeping at night. One of my earliest clear memories connected to that fear happened during a doctor's visit. Someone at school had become ill, and because I had been in contact with them, I needed an injection. I had never been afraid of needles before, in any meaningful way. But the moment the nurse approached, I completely lost control. Several adults had to hold me still. I remember screaming for them to get the needle away from me. At the same time, strange images flashed through my mind. Shadowy figures, sudden pain, bright bursts of light. After that, I began remembering more. I would wake at night and see figures beside my bed. Sometimes they seemed to be looking through the window. Once I became aware of them, it felt as though they no longer bothered hiding what they were doing. The experiences became most frequent when I was a young teenager. They happened often enough that I changed my entire sleeping schedule. I would come home from school and sleep as early as possible. Then, I would wake around the middle of the night and stay awake until it was time to leave for school. My hope was simple. If I was awake during the hours when the experiences usually happened, maybe they could not happen. Whether that actually worked, I do not know. It definitely damaged my school life and made things harder at home. As I grew older, the incidents became less frequent. Eventually, they happened only occasionally. Then came the last experience I can clearly remember. I had called my workplace and said I would not be coming in. Afterward, I went outside toward my car. I looked up. Something dark was moving across the sky. It had no fixed shape. The outline seemed to change as it traveled. For a moment, I thought it resembled a spacecraft I recognized from television. Then the shape changed again. It began moving toward me. I got into the car and tried to start it. The engine would not turn over. Then a painful buzzing sensation filled my head. By that point, the object was almost directly above and slightly ahead of the vehicle. A figure appeared near the car. I do not remember seeing it walk from anywhere. It seemed simply to be there. The car door opened on its own. The being approached carrying something like a narrow rod. It touched me with the object. Everything went black. When I came back to awareness, a significant amount of time had passed. My first reaction was to go to work, even though I had already called out. I cannot explain why. It was almost as though returning to normal routine was the only thing my mind could think to do. After that, the experiences stopped. Completely. But the habits they created never fully left me. I still have trouble sleeping at night. I arranged my life so that I could work overnight and sleep during the day. Relationships became difficult because my schedule and fears did not make sense to other people. I am doing much better now, but I still wonder how much my parents knew when I was young. Sometimes I suspect they were aware that something unusual was happening, even if they never explained it to me. There were also other incidents I cannot account for. More than once, I woke some distance away from where I remembered falling asleep. On a couple of occasions, I was wearing clothing that did not belong to me. I know how unbelievable this sounds. I cannot prove any of it. Maybe the early experiences were dreams. Maybe the later memories are connected to sleep disorders or something psychological. But the fear felt real. The missing time felt real. The changes to my life were real. And whatever the explanation may be, I spent years living as though something could come for me when I slept. Even now, long after the experiences stopped, part of me still lives by the rules I created to survive them. This was not my first strange encounter. By the time this happened, I had already experienced several things I could not explain. My parents never believed my interpretation of those events. They sent me to a therapist because they thought stress or anxiety might be causing the experiences. I understood why. What I described sounded impossible. Still, I could not make myself believe that everything had been imagination. Eventually, my parents thought a quiet vacation with my grandparents would help me relax. My grandparents lived in a small village in Turkey. Their house was isolated. The nearest neighbors were far away, and there were few trees around the property. The weather was hot, and sleeping indoors could be uncomfortable. One evening, after my grandparents had gone to bed, I decided to sleep outside on the balcony. I did not want to sleep directly on the ground because of insects and snakes, so the balcony felt safer. I gathered pillows and blankets. I also left a light on. After everything I had experienced, complete darkness made me uncomfortable. Almost immediately, I felt something was wrong. The temperature seemed to drop suddenly. Then came the feeling I knew too well. I was being watched. I looked back into the house. Nothing. I told myself I was becoming paranoid. Then I looked down toward the garden. Something was standing there. Even in the darkness, I recognized the shape immediately. It was tall, gray, extremely thin, much taller than an average person. Its shoulders were narrow. Its arms were so long they reached close to its knees. The proportions reminded me of one of those stretchable toys with unnaturally long limbs. It stood below the balcony staring at me. I stared back. I do not know how long we remained like that. Then I blinked. The figure was closer. That was the moment fear took over. I knew it was aware of me. The being tilted its head slightly, almost like an animal trying to understand something unfamiliar. Then it straightened again. Normally, I would have panicked. This time, I tried something different. I raised my hand slowly. I waved. The figure copied me. That frightened me even more. But I forced myself to remain calm. I asked what it was doing there. No answer. Then my body began to stiffen. My mind screamed at me to call for help. I tried asking again. Why are you here? The being tilted its head once more. Then it moved closer. Soon it was standing directly below the balcony, looking up at me with enormous dark eyes. From that distance, I could make out a small mouth that I had not noticed before. I was shaking. I had the overwhelming feeling that it wanted something from me. I did not know what. Then a man's voice suddenly called out. A local police officer was making his rounds and had noticed me standing on the balcony in the middle of the night. He asked what I was doing. I looked toward him, then immediately back toward the garden. The being was gone, completely. The officer could see how frightened I was. I was trembling so badly I could barely stand. I told him that something had been in the garden. He entered the property and searched. Nothing. He called other officers to check the surrounding area. They found no one. The activity woke my grandparents. When they heard what had happened, my grandfather reacted in a way I did not expect. He did not laugh. He did not dismiss me. He began asking detailed questions. How tall was it? What did its face look like? How did it move? What did I feel? That was when I learned something my family had never really explained to me. My grandfather had his own history of encounters. He did not tell me everything, but from what I understood, experiences like mine were not entirely new in our family. He believed he had been taken before. That revelation did not make me feel safer. It made the encounter more personal. Until then, I had wondered whether I was simply unlucky, imagining things or misunderstanding ordinary events. Now I had to consider another possibility. Whatever I thought I was experiencing might have been part of a pattern that existed before I was even born. One of my earliest clear unidentified flying object sightings happened while I was still in high school. Every school day, I walked a short distance from my house to the bus stop. One morning, the sky was still dark, though the weather was clear. I arrived at the usual place and stood with the same group of students who waited there every day. For a few minutes, I looked at my phone. Then I put it away and looked up. Almost immediately, something crossed the sky. It was a large, glowing green orb, followed by several smaller green lights. They moved incredibly fast through an opening between the tree lines. There was no sound, no visible trail, no slow approach. They appeared, crossed the open sky, and vanished behind trees near a lake. I stood there trying to understand what I had seen. Then I looked around at the other students. Most had not reacted, but the guy standing near me was staring frantically around the sky. He looked at me. "Did you see that?" I said yes. I asked him what it was. Obviously, he had no answer. Then the school bus arrived, and everyone got on. Later that morning, I was sitting in physics class when I heard a girl behind me talking loudly about strange flying lights she had seen before school. I turned around immediately. What color were they? Green. I told her I had seen them too. She became excited, mostly because someone else had finally confirmed that she had not imagined it. The interesting part was that she did not live in my neighborhood. She lived in a different community. Whatever we saw had apparently traveled across enough distance to be visible from more than one location. That does not prove it was extraterrestrial. It could have been something atmospheric, something military, a meteorological event, some kind of aircraft. I do not know, but 3 people in at least 2 different places saw the same unusual green lights moving across the morning sky. I have never seen anything exactly like them again. What stayed with me most was the relief on that girl's face when I told her I had seen it too. Sometimes the most unsettling part of a strange experience is not the experience itself. It is wondering whether you were the only one who saw it. That morning at least, I knew I wasn't. I had several strange experiences when I was younger, though most of them became less frequent as I got older. One of the most unforgettable happened when I was renting an upstairs room in a friend's house. My female boxer slept in the room with me. There was one window facing the neighborhood street. One night, my dog suddenly jumped onto the bed and positioned herself between me and the television. I tried nudging her aside with my feet. She refused to move. Instead, she stared directly at the window and began growling. It was a low, serious growl. I turned off the television and tried to sleep. She kept growling. Later, I woke to an unbelievably bright light pouring through the blinds. My first reaction was irritation. I assumed someone had parked outside with powerful headlights pointed directly at the house, but the brightness was unlike any car lights I had ever seen. The entire room seemed flooded with it. I got out of bed. I walked to the window. I placed my fingers between the blinds and started pulling them apart. Then everything disappeared. My next memory was not in the bedroom. I opened my eyes and found myself walking inside a strange room. The walls looked metallic. There were no visible seams or sharp corners. Everything curved smoothly into everything else. In the center was a simple rectangular structure that looked like a bed made entirely of dull gray metal. I sensed figures behind me. I cannot clearly describe them. I only knew they were guiding me toward the metallic bed. We were communicating somehow, not with spoken words. The information seemed to move directly through thought. I understood that they wanted me to continue forward. I remember reaching the side of the metal platform. Then instantly I was back in my bedroom. I was standing upright. My back was facing the window. The next morning I woke feeling terribly sick. At first, I did not remember the strange room at all. I felt nauseated and incredibly hungry. I stumbled downstairs. I took milk from the refrigerator and prepared a bowl of cereal. Then I looked through the kitchen window toward the backyard. My dog was outside. That stopped me. She should have been upstairs in my room. The moment I saw her, the memories came rushing back. The bright light, the window, the metallic room, the silent communication, the bed. I ran upstairs. The room looked disturbed. Furniture had been moved. Things were out of place. Because the weather had been cold, I had slept with several blankets. Every blanket was now arranged into an almost perfect spiral pattern on the bed. I stared at them. Then I destroyed the patterns with my hands, because looking at them made the whole thing feel too real. After that night, I noticed changes in myself. My speech became difficult. I began stuttering far more than before. Reading became harder too. Sometimes, I had to read the same passage several times very slowly before I could fully understand it. I felt as though something in my mind had changed. Those problems lasted for a long period. Then, much later, something happened again. I was alone in the house, relaxing in my room. Suddenly, the same brilliant light flooded the space. At almost the same moment, the entire house began to shake. It felt like an earthquake. The rumbling was intense but brief. Fear went through me immediately because I recognized the light. I knew what I associated it with. Then just as quickly, the light vanished. The shaking stopped. Everything became normal. And after that incident, something else changed. My reading improved. My speech returned to normal. The difficulties that had appeared after the first event seemed to fade away. I cannot explain any of it. Maybe there were medical or psychological reasons for what I experienced. Maybe the strange room was a dream, formed during a frightening sleep event. Maybe the house shaking had an ordinary physical cause. I have no proof that beings took me anywhere, but I still remember my dog growling at that window before the light appeared. I remember reaching toward the blinds. I remember walking through that seamless metallic room. I remember the feeling of communicating without speech. And I remember returning to a bedroom that did not look the way I had left it. Whatever happened that night remains one of the strangest events of my life. Stories like these are difficult because they live in the space between memory and evidence. Some people hear them and immediately believe. Others immediately reject them. Maybe the healthiest place to stand is somewhere in between. We can be curious without pretending we know more than we do. We can ask questions without turning every unexplained light into a spacecraft. And we can remain skeptical without mocking the person who lived through an experience they still cannot explain. Human memory is imperfect. Dreams can feel real. Sleep paralysis can be terrifying. Stress, exhaustion, medical conditions, unusual weather, secret technology, ordinary aircraft, and simple misunderstandings can all create experiences that seem impossible in the moment. At the same time, admitting those possibilities does not mean every mystery has already been solved. Sometimes the honest answer is simply, I don't know. There is humility in that. And maybe that is one of the most valuable lessons hidden inside all of these stories. We do not have to force every mystery into a comfortable answer. What matters is how we respond to the unknown. Fear can make us reckless. Obsession can make us ignore ordinary life. But curiosity can also make us more thoughtful, more observant, and more willing to listen. When someone shares a strange experience, kindness matters. You do not have to agree with every conclusion they reached. You do not have to believe exactly what they believe. But you can listen without cruelty. You can ask questions without humiliation. You can remember that behind every strange story is a human being trying to understand something that felt real to them. The choices we make after frightening experiences matter too. We can let fear control everything, or we can look for support, protect our well-being, remain grounded, and continue living with as much honesty as possible. If we discover that we misunderstood something, there is no shame in changing our minds. If we hurt someone because fear made us react badly, responsibility still matters. Apologies matter. Forgiveness, when freely given, can matter. And learning from our choices matters most of all. None of us sees the whole universe. None of us fully understands even the human mind. Maybe one day we will receive undeniable proof that life exists beyond Earth. Maybe some of the mysteries people have carried for decades will eventually receive ordinary explanations. Either way, living with uncertainty does not have to make us cold or afraid. It can remind us to stay humble, to stay curious, to treat one another gently, and to remember that being kind does not require us to have all the answers. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you can be alerted about future narrations. If you have a story of your own, you can submit it to the Let's Read official community on Reddit, share feedback with other listeners, and possibly hear your experience featured in a future video. You can also join the Discord community to interact directly with me and other listeners. And if you would like to support the channel even more, you can get early access to future narrations through Patreon for just $1 a month. You can also check out the Let's Read merchandise available through Spreadshirt. All of the links are in the description. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. Until we meet again, stay curious, stay grounded, take care of the people around you, and never be afraid to admit when the most honest answer is simply that we still do not know.